Hey everyone, my name is Daniel, and in this course, I want to teach you everything you need to know to get started with Vue.js. So we'll start out the course by taking a look at Vue's reactivity system, and you'll really get a first-hand glimpse into the power of the framework. We'll also dive into defining reactive data. We will display content to the page with loops, conditionals, attribute binding, and a whole lot of other things. I'll also show you how to react to user input to update the data or perform some kind of side effect on the page. And we'll round out the course with defining computed properties, setting up a local environment, and taking a look at the Vue application instance. By the end of the course, you'll have a firm grasp on the fundamentals of Vue.js, and we'll be ready to start learning about Vue components. We hope you enjoy this YouTube premiere of this season course that we also have available for watching over at vueschool.io, along with a bunch of other great courses. But without further ado, let's dive into the fundamentals of Vue.js. Hello, and welcome to the Vue Fundamentals course with the Composition API. If you're here, that means you want to learn Vue, and I don't blame you. It's pretty sweet. One thing you need to know before we start the course is this is a fundamentals course that's based on the Composition API. What does that mean? Well, there are two primary ways in which you can interact with Vue. That is via the Options API, which was the way that Vue was written all the way through version 2. However, with the release of version 3, a new API called the Composition API became available and revolutionized the way we interact with Vue and the way we write our Vue code. While the Options API still works in Vue 3 and is still relevant for a lot of cases, the future of Vue is really in the Composition API. So, let's get started. The best way to start learning Vue as a beginner is to use the official Vue single-file component playground, as you see on the screen here. I've left a link to it in the description below. What do we have going on here? Well, first, you'll see on line 4 that we've got a message defined as a reactive ref. Don't worry about what that really means right now. We'll cover it in depth more later. Then, down in the template, we have that message displayed in an h1 tag. It uses what's known as the Vue templating syntax, or sometimes known as the double mustache syntax. Finally, you can see the result of this code over on the right-hand side. That's cool and all, but one of the most exciting features of Vue is its reactivity system. In fact, I bet that's what you're here for. So let's see that in action. To do that, let's just start typing in the input below. Whoa! Isn't that awesome? As we type in the input, the heading automatically updates. This is possible because of vModel. It provides two-way data binding for our reactive references. And notice how short and sweet it is. Compare that to using vanilla JavaScript or even jQuery to do the same thing. Think of how much of a headache that would have been. We'd have to target both of the input and the h1 elements, we'd have to add an event listener to the input, and then we'd have to update the heading on every keystroke of the input. And that only takes care of the one-way data binding. With Vue, it's bound two ways. I keep saying that, two-way data binding, but what do I really mean? To demonstrate, let me duplicate the input so that there are two of them. Now, if I type in one of the inputs, you'll see that the other one changes as well. That means whether we're getting or setting the value of message, everywhere it's being used, message will always stay in sync. How cool is that? Now, this is really just a taste of the power that Vue provides us in such a simple and easy-to-use format. During this course, we'll explore everything Vue has to offer us while we build a shopping list app together. By the end of this course, you'll be ready to start using Vue in your own projects and tackle the other courses here at Vue School. Plus, you'll have the practical understanding you need to build a Vue app of your own. So, what are we waiting for? Let's dive into our next lesson and see how fast, easy, and fun it is to work with Vue. We've already used Vue's templating syntax to bind data to the DOM. But it turns out that it's so much more powerful than that. Inside of those double mustaches, we can use the full power of JavaScript expressions. So, if we wanted to, let's say, uppercase our message, we'd just have to add .toLocale uppercase. Over on the right-hand side, we can see that our header really stands out now. While we can do a lot of cool things inside of these double mustaches, there are a few limitations. The biggest is that we can only evaluate one expression at a time, so trying to use more won't work. Notice this big error that the playground is showing us. It's saying that we have an unexpected token, that is, the semicolon. We also can't declare new variables. Or evaluate if statements. But, if needed, we can use a shorthand if statement, otherwise known as a ternary statement. We could shorten this even further still by using the OR operator. Now, if I were to comment out message, we'd see welcome print to our H1. Very nice. By leveraging our current knowledge of JavaScript, we can wield the template syntax as a powerful tool for displaying and manipulating our data. Now that we have a better understanding of how to use it, let's remove that example input field from our template. Then, let's update our message variable to be a header variable. And say shopping list app. And we can remove the welcome fallback as well. I'll also add a style sheet to apply some nice styling for our shopping list application. We can do this in the playground by adding a new file with this plus button here. We'll call it main.css. And then I'll paste in some styles that will be available in the source code of this lesson. Awesome. Now we're ready to start adding items to our shopping list. Vue makes it super easy to loop over and render arrays and objects in a template with a directive called v4. Take this shopping list app we're working on here, for example. Let's say we want to render a list of shopping list items in an unordered list. Something like this. However, we don't really want these items to be hard-coded in our template. Instead, we want to store them as a reactive reference up in the script section. That way we can manipulate them, add to them, remove them, whatever we kind of need for a shopping list app. I'll call our variable items and assign it to a reactive reference that's an array of all our items. Now, we can use v4 to loop over each of these items in the template below. Awesome. Now it reads exactly the same as it did before. But this time, our items are dynamic and are coming from the reactive reference. Now, the syntax here might be a little tricky to remember at first, but if we break it down, it actually reads quite like a sentence. We'd like an li for each item in our items array. Also know that item here could be named really anything you'd like. It could be Foo, or Batman, or anything at all. But item best represents the individual elements in our array, so that's what we went with. Now, in order for Vue to be as performant as possible, it takes some shortcuts when rendering lists. Thus, in order to best help Vue know when to re-render what items, it's always recommended to add a special key attribute to all of your loops. The key attribute should be set to some unique ID per item, such as an ID from a database. This isn't always absolutely necessary for simpler arrays, like our items, but it's still a good practice and good for you to see the key in action. Let's change out the structure now of our items so that we can actually give each one their own unique ID. Now, we'll set the key attribute on each li to item.id. Then, since this is dynamic and we're not talking about a literal string called item.id, we've got to add a colon before key. This is known as attribute binding, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a later lesson. Next, we'll need to update what's rendered in the double mustaches from item to item.label. Awesome. As you can see on the right-hand side, everything is still working great. And now Vue can handle our code with optimal performance, without the risk of the loop having issues in the future, should we refactor it to be anything more than these simple LIs. If you'd like a more in-depth explanation of keys, check out the article Tips and Gotchas for Using Key with V4 in Vue.js 3. I've made a link to it in the description below. Suffice it to say for now though, just use them whenever possible. Back in the app, since each item is an object, we could even destructure ID and label from it, like so. And then the key would become just plain ID, and this would be just label. Nice. If we wanted to access the index of each item in the array, we can do that in the V4 by putting a parenthesis around the first part of the expression, and then separating the item from the index with a comma. And I'll just print it out within the li so that you can see it. Awesome. Now each list item begins with the index of the item in the array. You might also be tempted to use the index as the key. But this is actually what Vue does by default anyways, under the hood. And so really it's the exact same thing as not providing a key at all. And worse, it gives you the false security that you have provided a key when you actually haven't. So let's change it back. Not only does V4 work great for arrays, but it can handle objects too. Let's alter the format of our items to be an object, with the object keys being the item ID. And I'll also prepend each key with item dash, just to make it clear that these are not indexes. Over on the right-hand side, you can now see that item-1, item-2, and item-3 are printed out where the indexes were printed out before. These are the object keys. And each property in the object has been correctly rendered to the page. Very nice. While object support is really cool, it's not necessary for our current use case, so let's change the items back to an array now. Let's also remove the index from printing out in the li. One of the best parts about V4 is that it's reactive as well. If we were to push another item into the items array, then the loop would automatically update and that item would be included on the page. Likewise, if we were to remove an item from the items array, the page would update then as well. We'll see that very thing in action in a couple of lessons, so stick around. Alright, I hope you're enjoying the course so far and that you just learned a lot about looping over reactive data with v4. If you're curious to learn more information about the key attribute that was mentioned in that lesson, then I definitely recommend you check out our course, Common Vue.js Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. In it, we have a lesson dedicated to this exact topic. Alright, that's it for now. Continue enjoying the course, and I'll see you again later. Forms are an integral part of any application, and to be honest, they're really one of the places where Vue can shine the most. In this lesson, we'll learn how to set up an input field so that we can add items to this shopping list. First, we'll need to put the markup for the input in our template. It'll be the type of text, and we'll give it a placeholder. Add an item. Now, over on the right-hand side, sure enough, we've got our input. We can also type out a new item, no problem. However, how do we now access the value of the input from within our Vue application? Specifically within the script section of the Vue application. That way, we can add it to our array of items. Well, that's where vModel comes in. Vue's vModel directive makes it easy to bind reactive data to a form input, so that whether the data is modified by the user via the input or by the code, the data always stays in sync. Let me show you how it works. First, we'll need to create a new reactive ref called newItem. And I'll just initialize it to an empty string. Next, we need to add a vModel to our input and give it the value of newItem. Just like that, we've established a two-way data binding between our input and the newItem data. That way, they'll always stay in sync. Let's print out the value of the new item just under the input. That way you can see the data binding in action. Now, over on the right-hand side, if we type in the input, you'll see the text next to it updates in real time. Isn't that awesome? This shows us that typing in the input updates the value of new item. The reverse of this is also true. If we were to update the new item data property, the text of the input would change as well. Awesome. Now, vModel can also take modifiers. Modifiers can alter the behavior of vModel and are defined by adding a period followed by the modifier name. Let's take a look at an example. If you'd like your app to be a little less real-time and only update the new item after we've blurred the input, then you can add the lazy vModel modifier. Pretty cool. Other handy vModel modifiers include .number, which casts your data to a number, as opposed to the string version of a number, or the .trim modifier, which will automatically remove any surrounding white space from your data. That could be handy for our shopping list app. Alright, using vModel is not limited to just text inputs. We can also use it on text areas, selects, checkboxes, radio buttons, and more. Let's see how vModel works on radio buttons. Besides setting the label for the new item, let's also allow the user to select if the item is a high priority item or a low priority item. To do this, we'll add another reactive ref, which we'll call new item priority. And we'll initially set it to low. Then, we'll create a couple of radio buttons to bind it to. As you can see, we now have the two radio buttons. And they are both bound to new item priority with vModel. Finally, one has the value of low, and the other the value of high. Now, if we print out new item priority underneath the radio buttons, we'll be able to see it change when we toggle between the different priorities. And I'll also just throw a break tag in there so we can see it a little better in the browser. So now, low, our default, is selected and printed here. But when high is selected, high is printed here. Awesome. You'll notice that high is lowercase. That's because the value of the new item priority reactive ref is going to become whatever the value of the input is, not the label itself. Selects work much the same as radio buttons do, with the value being set on the options element instead of an input element. Let's change out the radio buttons to use a select instead. That way, we get the same behavior, just with a little different look. Alright, you see here our select. And we've bound new item priority to it with vModel. Also, it has two options, low and high, each with values like we saw the radio inputs have before. If we check it out in our app, you'll see that it looks a little different now, but it works just the same. Since new item priority only handles two values, it can be simplified to a boolean. Let's rename the reactive ref to new item high priority. That way, we can set it to true for high priority items and false for low priority items. Probably the best native UI element for a boolean value would be a single checkbox. A checkbox appears checked for true values and unchecked for false values. Let's change out our select for a checkbox. You can see now that the select has been replaced by an input with the type of checkbox, and it's bound to new item high priority. Since checked means it is high priority, we've labeled it high priority. Alright, let's update our printout to reflect the new reactive ref's name. Over in the application, our checkbox is unchecked because it's currently false. And when we check it, its value becomes true. As you can see, binding a checkbox with vModel to a boolean easily toggles the value between true and false. This is great for things like toggling dark mode, light mode, toggling some user setting, adding high priority to a shopping list item, or adding privacy agreements in forms. Sometimes checkboxes are needed for more than just toggling booleans. Sometimes they're needed for collecting multiple answers to a single question on a form. Let's add a reactive ref called ice cream flavors and set it to an empty array. Now, in our template, let's provide the three staple ice cream flavors as checkboxes. I have here the three checkboxes, and each one is bound to the same reactive ref. We can replace the printout of new item high priority with ice cream flavors so that you can see what happens when we select or deselect certain ice cream flavors. Right now, we see an empty array because nothing is checked. But as soon as I start checking ice creams, you see that they get added into the array. And unselecting an ice cream removes it from the array again. Awesome. Now that I've got you sufficiently hungry for ice cream, let's remove the checkbox example code. Remove the printout, and figure out how we can add some of that delicious ice cream to our shopping list. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to use events to allow users to add those new items to the shopping list. JavaScript wouldn't be the powerful language that it is without the ability to listen to events from all kinds of user input. Vue certainly is no different. It harnesses the power of JavaScript events in a short declarative syntax that makes it easy to react to clicks, scrolling, mouse movement, and more. Let me show you how simple events are in Vue with the VON directive. Take this shopping list app, for example. Currently, we can type in our input, but we need some kind of UI element, a button, for instance, for the user to interact with. And then we need to be able to listen for the click event of that button to actually add the item to the list below. Alright, in the code, we'll add a button. And we'll give it a class of btn and btn-primary, just to give it a little styling. Finally, I'll give it the label of save item. Nice. Let's also wrap our inputs and our button inside a div with the class of add item form. And this is just for styling purposes. Now that we've got our button in place, we can take advantage of the VON directive. On our button, we'll want to listen for the click event that gets triggered when a user presses the button. To do that, we can add VOnClick to our button. And then set it equal to items.push and push it a new item with the label specified in the new item data property. Then, in order to generate a new ID for the item, I'll use the item's length +1. Lastly, let me just clean up the template a little bit here so it's easier to read. Cool. If we go over to the right-hand side now, we can see that when we fill out our input and click on our button, that our new item gets added right to the end of our list. Awesome. While responding to the click event is great, VON also lets us listen to other events. When we're adding lots of new items to our list, it would be nice if we could just hit enter to save an item instead of clicking on our button. Alright, well, to do that, let's add another VON directive, this time to our input. Here, we'll need to listen for the key up event. But how will we know that we're clicking enter and not some other key? Well, in order to do this, we can use one of Vue's key modifiers to explicitly target the enter key. A key modifier is an event modifier that applies to keyboard-based events. Event modifiers allow us to alter the behavior of events using a declarative syntax. It's really pretty nice. So then, on our input field, after VON key up, we'll add .enter to listen for the enter key. Then, to get the same functionality as on the button, we'll just duplicate our code from earlier. And lastly, I'll just give it a quick cleanup. Alright, cool. Now we can press enter to save our newest item. And we did it without writing any additional boilerplate code. Besides enter and click, Vue also lets us respond to every event that JavaScript can. So, we could respond to tab, escape, delete keys, or right and command clicks, focus and mouse over, and more. There's also one more way we could go about doing the exact same thing. Let me show you, as this will probably be the more common way that you'll see this done in real life. I'll change the div with the class of addItemForm to an actual form element, and make sure to update the closing tag. Then, I'll take the V on from the button and paste it onto the form. Finally, the event that I want to listen to now is not the click event. Instead, it is the form's submit event. Awesome. This means we can remove the event listener from the text input. Why? Because when you click a button in a form, that fires the submit event. But that same submit event is also fired anytime you click enter within inside one of the form's inputs. So we get the same functionality, just with less code. When I try it out, I'll hit enter, and you actually notice that the page refreshed. That's because there's one more thing we need to do to our event. That is, we need to add a modifier, the .prevent modifier. This modifier is the same as calling prevent default on a normal JavaScript event, and will be necessary when you use the submit event on forms. Let's try it one more time. Awesome. So pressing enter works. And so does hitting save item. Sweet. Lastly, Vue provides a shorthand for the V on syntax. That is, using an @ symbol. Using the V on shorthand makes our templates look a little nicer, and it's a little easier to type. And to be honest, it's the only way I ever write it. Alright, this is great progress. In the next lesson, let's learn how to encapsulate our logic to add a new item into its own method. In this shopping list app, we're able to push a new item to the list with items.push. It would be more semantic for us, though, to encapsulate items.push into a named method. So, let's do that. Inside of the script section, I'll create a function called saveItem. Next, I'll copy our code from the submit event and add it to the method. One thing to note here is that when you're inside of the script section, in order to access the value of some kind of reactive reference, such as items or header, you actually have to use a special property named .value. The reason for this is because Vue uses proxies in order to create reactive data. This works great for data structures such as arrays and objects. However, that's not the case for primitive types, such as strings, numbers, and booleans. Therefore, whenever you call the ref function, what's returned is a reactive object with your actual data stored on the value property. We'll learn more about the ref function as well as its close sibling, reactive, in a later lesson. Alright, let's make sure we don't forget to include this .value on our other refs here as well. Nice. Now we can call our method on the submit event. And notice that we didn't even have to provide the parentheses at the end of the function. It's completely optional when you're calling methods on events like this in Vue. Alright, if we give things a try, everything still works. Great. we've taken some great strides to make our template easier to read and maintain. By removing the logic from our template to its own method, we can write cleaner JavaScript and provide clear method names so that we can better understand what our templates are doing. Plus, this will make future maintenance, testing, and debugging much easier for us to understand. Even with those awesome improvements, though, we're not quite done yet. Notice that when we add a new item, that the old item sticks around in our input. That's because we're not resetting our new item when we add it to our items. Alright, to fix that, we'll set new item to an empty string at the end of our saveItem method. Don't forget, we need to use .value here because we're referencing a reactive ref. Let's give it a try. And great, it worked. Resetting data in the client might be a little different than what you're used to, especially if you're coming from a language like PHP. With Vue, we have to be mindful that we're in charge of maintaining the state of our app for our users. This is an important part of the user's experience, so we need to make sure that we're not leaving any data behind. With our template cleaned up and refactored to avoid future issues, we've finished adding the functionality to save our new items. Awesome. In the next lesson, we'll work on hiding our form when we're not using it. Sometimes, it's necessary to only render HTML when certain conditions are true. Therefore, Vue provides us with the vIf and vElse directives that let us conditionally render elements. Alright, we can use this in our shopping list app to show a message if there are no items in the list. Let's start by commenting out the items in the items array. In our template, we can now add a p tag with a vIf that only shows when there are no items. On the right-hand side, we can see that our empty state message is now showing. Excellent. And if we add a new item, then it goes away. Great. While this is a great example of conditionally toggling one element, what if we wanted to show two different states? Let's see how to do that by hiding the form when we're not using it. Let's start by adding an editing reactive ref. And I'll initialize it to false. Now, we can add a vIf to our form wrapper. We can set it to show when editing is true. Over on the right-hand side, we can see that our form is no longer there because the condition is false. If we inspect the element, we can see that our form is actually missing completely from the DOM. That's because vIf actually toggles the existence of that element on the page. Alright, let's add some buttons now to show and hide the form. We can do that by wrapping our h1 in a div with the class of header. And note that this is really just for styling. Then we can add two buttons, one for cancel and one for add item. Now, we can make use of the vElse directive. When we use vIf and vElse together, we can dynamically toggle elements based on how our conditional evaluates. In this case, we'll want to show the cancel button when editing is true. Otherwise, we want the add item button to show. Sweet. Now we're ready to add another method that will be responsible for changing the value of our editing reactive ref. I'll call it do edit. Then I'll pass through an argument, e, short for editing, and set our editing reactive ref to it. Let's also clear out our new item so that we don't persist any halfway finished items. Now, we just need to add that to our buttons using the v-on directive. And of course, cancel will be do edit with the argument of false. And add item will be do edit with the argument of true. Over on the right hand side, you can see that clicking the buttons now toggles the form. Vue uses the double mustache syntax to render data to the DOM. But how would we make an element attribute like an href dynamic? Well, with the v-bind directive, we can couple any HTML attribute to our reactive references. For example, let's add a link to our template. Then we'll use v-bind on the href, referencing the new item reactive ref that's bound to our text input. And finally, we'll give it the label dynamic link. Awesome. Now, if we add a URL to our input, we should be able to click it, and it will take us wherever we've typed in. We can add any URL we'd like, such as google.com. Or vueschool.io. Awesome. This is an incredibly powerful feature of Vue. Now we can build templates where any attribute responds to our data. For our shopping list app, let's toggle the disabled attribute on our Save Item button when there isn't any content in our input. That way, we won't accidentally add blank data to our shopping list. We'll start by clearing out the example link. And then we can add a v-bind to our button. We'll say that the button is disabled when the length of new item is strictly equal to 0. Now, our button won't work until we have some content in our input. Awesome! This is also a great technique for enforcing minimum character requirements on our inputs as well. I'll just change out the triple equals 0 here to a less than 5. In other words, our button will be disabled when the input is less than 5 characters long. You can see our button is grayed out here. We'll start typing. And as soon as we hit 5, the button lights up, and we can add the item to our list. Very nice. Finally, just like v-on has a shorthand syntax with the @ symbol, v-bind can also be shortened to just a colon. And once again, this is probably how you'll see it used most often. While we can use v-bind with every attribute, there are some special use cases, and we'll cover those in the next lesson. When using attribute bindings, classes are a special case, because we can pass additional data to determine when to apply certain classes. To see this in action, let's add a strikeout to some items in this shopping list app. Here, we have an li for each item in an item's reactive ref. To add a strikeout class, let's use the special object syntax. Here, our object property is the name of the class we'd like to toggle. and this comes from our main.css file. The value is the conditional we respond to. For us, that's whether or not the item has a truthy purchase property. Also, now we must destructure purchased from the item. Great. Now let's uncomment our initial dataset of items and randomly add purchase properties to each one. Over on the right-hand side, you can see now that the items with their purchase property set to true have a strikeout through them, while the last one doesn't. Pretty incredible, right? If we take a moment to inspect them, we can see that the class is actually getting toggled in the DOM. Nice. With the object syntax, we can also continue to add other conditional classes if we'd like. For instance, let's add a high priority property to our items. And I'll initialize some as false, and others as true. Now, in the class binding, we can keep track of both conditionals. Awesome. This is pretty great. But what if we also wanted to include some static classes? It would be kind of silly to have to do something like static class true. Technically, this would work. If we inspect the element, you'll see that all the LIs do in fact have that static class. However, a less verbose way to do it would be just to add a regular class attribute for any static classes in addition to the bound classes. Cool. Another special syntax available for adding classes is the array syntax. To demonstrate, I'll make a copy of our LIs, effectively duplicating each item in our list. Now, with the array syntax, each element in the array is another class. As is, these classes are static, and there's no condition specifying whether or not to add them. Sure enough, over on the right-hand side, each list item has a duplicate row that always includes both the strikeout and priority classes. If we wanted to make the classes conditional in the array syntax, we'd have to do that manually with an expression that uses the ternary operator. However, this approach also means that we could add more than one class when item.purchased is true, or even provide a different class when purchased is false. Awesome. Lastly, we can even combine the array syntax and the object syntax together if we wanted to. This will result in the exact same classes being added as in the LI just above. Finally, while we're adding in these arrays and objects directly in our template, should your use case call for it, you could also define them as reactive refs. Alright, with our dynamic strikeouts set up, let's add a method to toggle it on each item. First, I'll remove this extra LI, as it's not needed and was only added for demonstration purposes. Then, we'll create a new method called togglePurchased. As an argument, we can pass the item itself to the function, and then update the purchase property directly. We'll set item.purchased to its opposite, effectively toggling it. With the method taken care of, we can now add it to each LI with the v_on directive. Now, since we've destructured the item within the v_for, we don't actually have direct access to the item. So we've got a couple of different options. We could target the item in the items array with the index, and that would work just fine. Or we could get the item directly in the v-for, and then use it. This means, though, that we'd have to prefix all the properties that we had destructured out before with item dot. I'll go ahead and do that. Awesome. Now clicking on each of the items in the shopping list toggles its purchase property. Now that we're styling high priority items, let's also make the high priority checkbox actually affect the newly created items. In the save method, we'll set the high priority property on the new item to new item high priority.value. And in both places where we're resetting new item, let's also reset the high priority. Alright, let's give it a try. The item has the right styling, and yep, it has the priority class. Awesome. There's nothing to it with Vue. Vue has another powerful feature called computed properties. Computed properties let us perform transformations or calculations based on our data. Now, don't let that scare you. I know it sounds a little abstract, but it's really fairly straightforward, but super powerful. Let's take a look at an example in order to get an idea of what computed props are. Let's say we wanted to enforce a character limit on our new item field, and we wanted to show our users how many characters they had left while they typed. Well, that's the perfect use case for a computed property. In order to do this, the first thing we would need to do is import a computed function from Vue. Just like ref, computed is a helper function provided by Vue that helps us interact with its reactivity system. Okay, next I'll create a variable called character count, and I'll set it equal to a function that computes the number of characters of new item. Now, in order to handle this as a computed prompt that will behave in a performant manner and only update when new item updates, we'll pass the function to the computed function. And that's how you create a computed prompt. Now let's use it to display the character count on the screen. I'll use a p tag with the class of counter, print out the character count, and then just hardcode in a static 200 here. Alright, now when we type in our input, you can see the character count update in real time. Isn't that awesome? Computed properties are extremely powerful tools for encapsulating data transformations and manipulations that always stay in sync with the data that they reference. Alright, so let's try another example. How about we use a computed property to flip our items so that the newest items will always show up at the top of our list. First though, let's get rid of the example code from our character count example. I'll remove the p tag and the computed prop from the script section. Now, underneath items, I'll create a new variable called reversed items. And once again, we'll call computed, passing it a function. Inside of reversed items, we need to return a reversed array of items. It's very important to actually return a value from a computed property. Otherwise, Vue won't know what the value should be. Alright, well then to flip our items array, we can use JavaScript's .reverse method. However, the reverse method actually alters the array that it's called on. That's not what we want. Remember that computed properties are only for transforming data for our presentation layer. They should not alter or change the existing data. To avoid that, we can use the spread operator to make a clone or copy of the array. Accidentally changing or mutating an underlying data value in a computed prop is a big source of headaches and bugs. So be sure to keep that in mind when you're working with them. Now, to use this in our template, we'll simply replace the items in our v4 with reversed items. And on the right-hand side, you see it does exactly what we wanted it to do. Let's also try adding a new item to the list. Sure enough, it goes right to the top. Before we end this lesson on computed props, let me show you one more little tip on working with them. We can shorten up the definition of the computed prop by using an arrow function on one line that infers the return statement, like this. I wanted to mention it because you'll probably see this fairly often, and for short, sweet computed properties, this works great. Let's step away from our shopping list app for just a moment to get a grasp on the fundamentals of Vue's reactivity system. We've been using ref throughout this course in order to define reactive data for our app. This is necessary because Vue has to set up JavaScript proxies in order to listen in to the reading and writing of our data. That way, it can do the reactive things that it does. But did you know that there's an alternative function to ref called reactive? Well, reactive works a whole lot like ref does, except that it only works for non-primitive data types. That is, data types like objects and arrays. For example, let's create a variable called state. And I'll set it equal to an object, on which I'll call reactive. Then we'll give that object a property of count, and we'll set it equal to 0. Now, inside of the template, I can print out the count via state.count. Now, let's get rid of that input and instead provide a button to increment our count. On click, we'll say state.count ++. Alright, over on the right-hand side when we click the button. Sure enough, it increments as we'd expect. Alright, this doesn't look a whole lot different from ref so far, but there are a couple major differences. The biggest difference is that we don't have to use the .value property that you've seen when we use ref. Let's see that. Here, I'll create a method to increment our count for us. And here you'll see that we will directly alter state.count. There's no state.value or state.count.value or anything like that needed. Alright, let's use our function as the event handler now. Sure enough, it still works. You might be wondering then, why would I ever use ref and not just use reactive so I don't have to think about the .value? Well, there are a couple reasons. The most obvious one is that Reactive just won't work with primitives. Thus, state here couldn't be a string, nor could it be a number, or a boolean. Therefore, for all such primitive values, you'll have to use ref, or find some kind of larger object for that primitive to live in, like our count did. The second downside of Reactive is that it's not easily replaced. Let me show you. Inside the increment function, instead of incrementing count directly, I'll set state to a whole new object. Then I'll set its count property to the incremented count. And state has to be defined with let so that we can override it. Now when I try it out on the right-hand side, yeah, the number is no longer incrementing, while overriding the entire reactive variable state in our instance doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. There are other cases where you really want to be able to do it. Thus, that's why ref exists. Just a small tip, a lot of people will go ahead and use ref for everything, even their arrays and objects. That way they just get used to using .value all the time, and they don't have to think about, should I use it or should I not? But really, it's personal preference and totally up to you. Lastly, one thing that you've probably already noticed throughout the course is that while .value is required for refs in the script section, Vue does what's called automatic unwrapping of those refs in the template section. That way you don't have to specify .value inside of the template. That's the fundamentals of reactivity in Vue. So, which option do you think you'll end up going with? Using ref or reactive? My personal preference is just to default to ref everywhere. It works great. And if you want to make your data even more pleasant to work with, then I suggest you learn how to use TypeScript with Vue.js 3. And turns out we have a course all about it. It's over at vueschool.io. I've left a link to it in the description below. And I think it's worth checking out if you're already familiar with TypeScript. Well, that's it for now. Continue enjoying the course. So far, we've been playing with Vue in the official playground provided by the official Vue docs. However, at some point you'll really want to get up and going with a real local project. Let me show you how to do that in this lesson. In order to follow along with this lesson, you'll need to have Node.js installed. I've left a link to install it in the description below. Alright, in order to get your project set up, you want to open up your terminal and run npm init vue at 3. And what this will do is this will bootstrap a project for you with Vite. If you don't know about Vite, we've got a complete course dedicated to it. It's an awesome tool that provides an excellent, snappy, lightning-fast developer experience to help you create your projects fast. Alright, I'll click Enter to proceed here, and the tool will walk me through a few setup questions. We'll call the project Vue Fundamentals course. And we don't need TypeScript or JSX. We don't need Vue Router right now, and no for Pina. We'll also say no to Cypress. If you don't know what some of these are, don't worry about that right now. As you grow and learn more about the Vue.js ecosystem, you'll get familiar with some of these. Alright, I'll skip ESLint. And we're all done. Now we can copy and paste these 3 commands here in green to get our dev server up and running. And just like that, we've got a local site. Awesome. We can visit it at the URL presented here. Cool. Now, let's open up the codebase in VS Code and take a quick look around. Within the source directory, you'll see a file called app.vue, and this file will look somewhat similar to the code that we've been working with throughout the course. It has a script section and a template, and in case you didn't know it, you can also include style sections in these files. Files like the one I'm in right now that end in .vue are called single file components and are beyond the scope of this course. But I encourage you, open up app.vue, play around, try to recreate some of the things we did throughout the course, and you'll find that it works much the same as in the playground. But now you've got Vue up and running on your local machine. If for some reason you don't care about support for script setup, then you could actually install Vue without the build step that Vue provides, using a link to the CDN. This is an even faster way to get started, but you'll have to use the composition API from within a setup method, which we didn't go over in this course, but you can learn about in the docs, or you'd have to use the options API instead. Really though, using Vue to provide a build step and utilizing script setup is the way to go, in my opinion. In this last lesson, I just introduced you to Vue to power your local development. Well, it turns out Vue is actually a super powerful development and build tool that has a ton of different features. If you'd like to know more about Vue and how to utilize all of these different features that it offers, then definitely check out our course, Rapid Development with Vue. It's over at vueschool.io, and I've left a description to it in the link below. Well, you're almost done with the course. You're doing great so far. I hope you enjoy the last lesson or two. When bootstrapping a Vue.js project with the Create Vue tool, a file called main.js is provided in the source directory. This file is the entry point for your Vue app, and in it, a Vue application instance is created. This was all done behind the scenes when you were working in the Vue.js playground. Now though, it's good to know how it actually works. The object that we pass to the create app function is a Vue component. Most of the time, this will be a single file component, like app.vue that we saw in the last lesson. This component is known as the root component, and every Vue application that you create requires it. While the examples we've seen throughout this course only used the one root component, many real-life applications will be made up of many components that form a component tree. This example in the docs shows what a to-do list app might look like, with a to-do list component under app, a to-do item component under to-do list, and to-do delete button and to-do edit button components under the to-do item. In our local project, you can see something very similar. In app.vue, we use a component called the welcome. And then, inside of the welcome, other components are used, like welcome item and the documentation icon. Notice that using Vue components in the template looks similar to the syntax for using plain old HTML elements. However, the name for components should always be multi-worded. To learn more about defining and using components to compose your application, I suggest you check out our Components Fundamentals course. I've left a link to it in the description below. Alright, back in main.js, the last thing to do is to mount the Vue application to the DOM. Mount is just a fancy way of saying, make the Vue application, which is made up of JavaScript, show up on the page in HTML. Now, the mount method takes a CSS selector to target the element that we want to mount it to. This element lives in the index.html file in the root of our project. And this is the file that initially gets served to the browser and includes the JavaScript code for our Vue app. In conclusion, creating a Vue application instance is always the first step to building a Vue app. Plus, there's still more you can do with the Vue application instance, such as registering global components, registering plugins, and a whole lot more. Suffice it to say, though, that for now you have a basic understanding. And don't worry if it doesn't all make sense. The Create Vue tool will handle setting this up for you. Congrats! You've completed the course. With the principles, topics, and syntaxes learned in this course, you've covered probably about 60 to 70% of the things that you'll use in a normal Vue.js project. There's still plenty more to learn though. My suggestion for next steps would be to build a small to-do app, something like our shopping list app, of your very own, to practice some of the things that you've learned. And then go check out one of our courses on Vue components and Vue single file components to gain a little deeper knowledge and add some more tools to your tool belt. If you'd like to see how some of these concepts work with the Options API as opposed to the Composition API, you can watch our course Vue.js 3 Fundamentals, which essentially is the same course, but using the Options API. Alright, that just about wraps everything up. We hope you've enjoyed the course. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us via the comments section below, via email, or on Twitter. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next course.